Welcome all to this second last instalment of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance's 10th anniversary seminar series. My name is Madeleine Egan. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Centre, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Canberra is built. Sovereignty was never ceded on that land. I pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in attendance today. As you may know, our wonderful research centre is 10 years old this year, and to celebrate, we're hosting a series of 10 conversations on some of the most pressing questions facing deliberative democracy. So today we're asking the 9th of these big questions, which is what can deliberative democracy learn from social movements? And we're asking this question in the context of what's sometimes called the deliberative wave, which has seen deliberation being taken up by state actors, often in institutionalized forms. And the deliberative mini-public is probably the most iconic of these forms. But meanwhile, in the public sphere, social movements are really challenging us to reflect on these innovations and on the role of deliberation in democracy more broadly. Social movements' contingent and often critical engagement with state institutions prompts us to ask whether mini-publics and other deliberative innovations commissioned by public authorities can really disrupt existing power structures, or whether they reinforce those structures. Social movements' communicative practices, which often involve narrative, visual and artistic expression, demand that we interrogate our definitions and our models of deliberation. We're very lucky to be joined today by two speakers whose work has long engaged with these issues from both theoretical and practical perspectives. Our first speaker is Claire Mellier, a facilitator, process designer, and researcher with expertise in participatory and deliberative democracy. She's the knowledge and practice lead at the Iswe Foundation, and in 2020, she co-founded the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Crisis for COP26. She's interested in exploring how deliberation can address systemic issues of power, polarization, and trauma. Our second speaker is Nicole Doerr, who's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Copenhagen. Her work is on deliberative democracy and visual practices, deliberation and critical practices of intersectional translation, and migrants and minorities' contributions to deliberative democratic practice and theory. So today's conversation will have two parts. For the first 30 minutes or so, I'm going to invite our speakers to offer a response to the question at hand, and also give them an opportunity to put a question or a reply to each other. And this part of the seminar is going to be recorded, and later we'll share that on our YouTube channel. For the second 30 minutes, I'll open up the floor and invite questions and ideas from all of you in the audience. So now I'd like to invite Claire to begin the conversation. So Claire, how would you like to respond to the question, what can deliberative democracy learn from social movements?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the people getting up early or going to bed late. And so thank you for inviting me to reflect on this question. And I will just acknowledge that the place I'm coming from to explore this question is as a practitioner of deliberative democracy, with an understanding of what deliberative democracy can learn from social movement, having been exposed to these social movements in the UK. So this is where my sharing will be grounded and coming from. And what I want to do is just in a way tell a story of my encounter with the movement Extinction Rebellion and other movements which have emerged after that, back between 2019 and now, and how they have helped me reflect on deliberative practice, but also challenged me to engage with some of the critical kind of questions that they're posing for us as practitioners, but also as academics who are on this call. So back in 2019, I am in the UK, and I observed the rise of a movement, Extinction Rebellion, which places citizens' assemblies at the core of their demand for system change. They had three core demands: telling the truth, a transition to a climate and fair, so climate justice, and the third one was citizens' assemblies. And what that movement was doing was saying we need, as a society, we need to come together and grapple with the complexity of climate change. And they didn't provide the policy solutions. They were saying we need to explore that through the mode of deliberation. And that was shaking at the time, shaking up the conversation around deliberative democracy. And after that initial kind of demand, we saw lots of local authorities and even governments all around the world declaring climate emergencies and then initiating citizens' assemblies at different levels. And some people have called this the deliberative wave. We know there's been about 200 climate citizens' assemblies that have happened since 2019 around the world. And partly, I think this is partly due to this push and demand from this movement. What's been fascinating for me is and I've been involved in quite a lot of these processes, either as facilitators or designers of them, or researching and evaluating them. And what Marit Hammond was describing back in 2019, she was really early on actually identifying the tensions we were seeing between deliberative democracy being, or citizens' assembly being, either a system reinforcing process or a system disruptive or disrupting process. I think for me that was really enlightening, because I could see how we were seeing this wave of assemblies taking place, but they were positioned as invited spaces in the way John Gaventa describes them. So commissioned by power holders with particular framing and in a particular context, and helping to create a discussion on climate and social justice, but not really potentially disrupting the power structures that they were operating in. And this is, for me, what we need to ask ourselves as practitioners and academics now, almost 6 years after the movement has emerged in the UK, is where are we at, and what can we take stock from all these processes that have happened? What is the impact? And a lot of people are asking, what's the impact of these processes? And initially, there was an assumption that if you had a very strong mandate from a power holder, a very good process, this was going to lead to change, because you needed the mandate to see some kind of policy change. But the reality is that we know the complexity of policy making makes it very difficult to see the change happen. And some of the recommendations that come out of these processes get cherry-picked, watered down. They are And we've seen that in France, for instance, with the Climate Convention, where you've had a citizens' assembly that led to a climate and resilience bill. And we know that what's in the bill is very much a watered down, a cherry pick version of the recommendation from the assembly. So what we're confronted with now is social movements after 5 to 6 years of, you could say, experimentation. They're asking us, let's look at the impact these processes have had, and can we continue doing the same thing we've been doing for these past 6 years? Can we continue to trust the established power holders to actually make the change happen? And so they're asking these questions around theories of change and how change happens. And they're suggesting that, or actually more than suggesting, I think they're pushing us to really look at power and do power analysis, which in a way I think has been missing from this deliberative wave. And that's why I tried to do in a paper I wrote with Stuart Capstick earlier in the summer, which was for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, which was looking at how can citizens' assemblies help navigate the systemic challenges brought up by the public crisis. And in that paper, I'm looking at using John Gaventer's Power Cube to explore the different levels of power, the different forms. And, I think it's been really helpful to have that framework to look at invited spaces versus claimed spaces. But I think what we haven't really explored in depth is the different forms of power, so invisible, visible, and hidden. And I think this is where movements like new forms of movements now saying we need to explore things further, such as the Humanity Project in the UK, or Just Stop Oil, which has created a new initiative called Assemble, which is specifically looking at deliberative praxis for the movement. The movement Just Stop Oil. They're telling us you really need to look at the systemic context. So in a way, they're saying you need to look at the deliberative system and not look at citizens' assemblies as a tool, but look at the system they're operating within. So what's really interesting with initiatives like the Humanity Project, which is happening in the UK at the moment, and you can look online. I think it's forcing us to explore what's the role, for instance, of media in deliberative practice. How do they shape the narratives that we are dealing with? How come, for instance, also in the UK, they're saying, how come we've got very strict legislations now that are crushing protest? There's a legislation in the UK that is now preventing people from walking, slow walking and demonstrating. So this is where I feel now the movement is at, and it's telling us you can't just assume that delivering a good citizens' assembly with a mandate will lead to change, and we need to look at the vested interest that are preventing the change from happening. And just to give you maybe as a bit of provocation or wrap up, I don't know if you heard, there was an announcement earlier last week actually on carbon capture and storage in the UK, with an announcement from the government to fund to commit to £22 billion investment in carbon capture and storage. And the people behind that decisions are Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer. What was fascinating about this for me is that the Climate Assembly UK that happened back in 2019 had explored carbon capture and storage as part of its deliberation, and the recommendation from the Assembly members were very clear that they were not in favour of this, and they were in favour instead of a nature-based solution. And the people who are right now in the heart of governments, such as Rachel Reeves and Darren Jones, who was the MP who had one of the 6 parliamentary committees who had commissioned this assembly, and also Chris Stark, who was one of the expert leads, were deeply involved in that process. And despite knowing what came out of this process, and 4 years down the line, we've got a big announcement for a major carbon capture investment. So I'll leave you with a question, really, which is, at this point in time, in the context of the climate ecological emergency and the poly crisis more widely, how can deliberative democracy have an impact on people's lives? And I think this is what movements like Humanity or Assemble and many other initiatives are really confronting us with.
Thank you very much, Claire. Next, I'll hand over to Nicole Doerr. Nicole, what do you believe deliberative democracy can learn from social movements?
Thank you so much, Madeleine, and thank you so much, Claire and Nicole Curato, who organized the meeting. So I want to start with some thoughts about the current situation and then talk about the dialogue between social movements, also social movement studies, and deliberative democracy. I think deliberative democracy is an outcome of what activists thought, and I think it's coming from those activists who were older and wiser than I was when I was doing my first social movement. So it's a dialogue about the old and the new. And deliberation is a key mechanism for our world, especially with the global assemblies that some of you guys are organizing. It's a key mechanism for us to have change without blood. So when social movements become polarizing and when they trigger hatred, in a way, they work against what the social movement can do, which is to convince the entire system. So protest and social movement is a very important and a terrific art because it has so much power and it cannot be predicted. And I'm here talking across time, revolutions. Think about the most powerful movements in your countries. It's the dominant ones, the ones that made the state. In my country, it's Christianity. And at one point, not so long ago, it was fascism. Everyone was excited about these movements, and those who weren't were either killed or forced. So when we talk about social movements, there is also these other movements, the far right, and the threat of change that is forceful. So deliberation is a wonderful tool, and movements always change how that is done. And they do so with rhetoric and with the art of storytelling. And now with digital media, they intervene in an extremely polarized public where all kinds of people and states are diffusing affective, hateful messages, trying to make good arguments for progressive and inclusive change. That's an art. So I bring in some theories. Of course, my teachers, Donatella Della Porta, Francesca Poletta, so many others have been writing on how movements, how deliberative theorists come from movements, can learn from social movements by thinking about democratic innovation and democracy from below, that always tries to be more inclusive. But when you see how activists speak these days, you wouldn't think that there is so much democracy work happening. So we're in a phase where social movements to the outside world do not show unity nor solidarity, but divisions. And so how come? Why is this happening? I would argue that at least since the Trump presidency, I mean, and by that I mean 2016, we see an agonistic public space on digital media through hateful messages, through stereotyping, through stigmatization of already minoritized groups, and through a portrait of the ideal citizen, a reenactment of democracy, we call it, that is exclusionary. And that triggers social movements to also become exclusionary and polarized, but not all movements. So it is really important from a movement perspective to talk to how activists try to create self-portrait messages, convincing through making visual arguments on digital media that foster the common good and progressive perspectives, like what Claire Mellier was just describing in your presentation. So in social movement studies, we interview activists and we collaborate with them. For example, in a project I'm doing at the University of Copenhagen, the Polarvist project, where we've interviewed Friday for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Last Generation activists and Global South climate activists on how they try to convince global publics and local publics on a deep ecological transformation work. So this is in social movement studies, again, it's the dialogue between practitioners and the research. This is the decolonial and intersectional perspective on deliberation that Nicole Doerr and others have been working on. And my own work here is on how movements translate knowledge through deliberation or through visual persuasion practices. So I want to give some examples. You mentioned, Claire, you mentioned power, and that's also some of the tasks to think about. So this is an interview with one of the Fridays for Future activists who is embedded in the UN, and she helps activists who come from the Global South to not be harmed by their governments or by interest groups who don't want them to be at COP summits or civil society summits. So she helps them to not even be criminalized, but not be killed. And she reflects critically on how activists talk and persuade on digital media. She says, I quote, "So this image on the right side is actually a good representation of the German climate movements. So basically, the visual politics here is we want to have something of Greta Thunberg's fame, but however, the decisions are taken in the movement by a few single white German people. At the COP summit, all people from Germany are white. So this is really absurd." End of quote. I translated freely from German. So here you have the key questions of participation in the movement, locally or in Germany, and representation. So what the movement does is very often, here I have featured some theories of translation, Mona Baker's work and my own work that is trying to think about how movements, when they tell stories, translate them. And there's always an ideology of translation and of storytelling. So here's another quote from Fridays for Future. So the idea by the movement, it's the same activists speaking, is we need to continue doing decolonial work. And for that, we really need concretely to reflect about, of course, the colonial history. Then the whole movement benefits if people are basically making this normal. So this is Friday for Future Germany today. They're constantly criticizing themselves. And this is why social movements bringing in the new into this world are so interesting for thinking about deliberative democracy. So here the idea is that the movement wants to bring in the self-critique is, oh, we're too white. To middle class in Germany, we want to bring in young people with a migration background and the Black Lives Matter movement. So for that, the activist whom I interviewed and her group created BIPOC for Future as a movement that connects to migrant movements. And they also very much tell stories and bring out messages about climate change through heroes. So this is the work by Jim Jasper and others, storytelling through heroes, through characters, through enemies and foes rhetoric. Here you have Malcolm X as a hero for young BIPOC people, minorities in Germany, and yet a transcultural image for people to basically think about an ideal of citizenship in Germany that's not like the typical Friday for Future activist. However, whenever movements use rhetoric, they include one positionality and exclude another. So how can movement tell inclusive stories? And how do they do so at the global level on climate change? In our project, we study how climate conversation has been happening since the Paris summit. And we do not only study progressive movements, but also the far right and denialists, conspiracy theorists, international organizations. We study everyone who makes visual arguments on digital media since the Paris summit. We find something really interesting. Both some parts of the climate movement, the NGOs, as well as international organizations and governments will communicate about climate change and the future of the world in images like the one you see here on the right side from the Glasgow COP summit. We call this nature technology harmony images. This image is a visual argument for change, for another future, another world. But if you're honest, or if you look at it, you can also see that it's quite a homogeneous future where we Europeans are selling our products, solar panels and windmills, and nature is represented a little bit homogeneous. We find that this is one of the most frequent image types in making argument on climate justice. It is pushed by policymakers and those who want green transition as a capitalistic technique. And it also doesn't show humans. So this disconnect between humans and nature is very Eurocentric. And it's dominant and it's convincing. However, it's still a linear version of there will be another future. It's very interesting. In the Global South and in Latin America, the movements, the NGOs, and also some of the states are showing another picture, human and nature together. These are grasped as a typical image visual argument put forward by a group that emphasizes young people, diverse people, more people of color. This is consistent when we look at the COP summits. COP summit pictures, 90% of them look like the picture here on the upper right side, the people in the conference, the main policymakers. So it's quite a male-centered and a human-centered picture. Nature is only there as a symbol. If you, however, look at Latin American social movements and movements from the South, nature is featured as real objects and subjects, and it is also there, and it's the indigenous. In our analysis, we compared how European Fridays for Future activists and peers from the Global South talk about try to mobilize young people. On the left side, you see a German call. We can do 1.5 degrees Celsius, strike to make politicians act. So this is a typical kind of way that the movement uses the globe, the most important icon. And on the upper right side, it has new IPCC report shows we can do it. So this image is from 2021. It's a little bit older. So the numbers are older. On the right side, you see Fridays for Future from the MAPA channel connected to activists in the Global South. And it's a very different world that is shown, a globe that is burning in the South. This is an icon of inequality and of trying to make people in Germany aware of what is happening elsewhere. So we interviewed the makers and the activists who are the brokers to diffuse images and visual arguments from the Global South. Here is a young trans migrant from Germany who said, I quote, "When a global call comes out, then Fridays for Future info channel posts images that look like advertisement. They are optically designed for white majority societies. But the real point is to talk to real people, young people without a high school degree. That means that we as migrants and BIPOC need to do intersectional translation work, which means to deal with visual design. So I could end here, but I want to add one more slide. The interesting thing is that visual translation and convincing work looks very different depending on the country and the movement group you're studying and that you're talking to. And here, for example, you have the Argentinian Fridays for Future, who emphasize people, working class people, diverse populations, but they also have animals as agents of the movement identity. In this picture, it's the birds. In other pictures, it is, for example, the capybara, a water animal. The river itself, in the rights of nature perspective, is a speaker within deliberative democracy or within the deliberations the movements propose. So we are currently studying this. And I know I've seen Hans Asenbaum, he's also working on rights of nature. So how can, in terms of deliberative democratic theory, I think the rights of nature perspective and the way of including diversity in a non-violent way and making good arguments that reach out to different populations all over the world is super important. Thank you very much. That's what I had to say.
Thank you, Nicole. Just before I open this conversation up, would either of you, Claire or Nicole, like to ask the other a question or perhaps offer a response to something that you've heard?
I had a question for Nicole because I was so influenced and inspired by your book, Political Translation, when we were thinking about the Global Assembly and how to design a process that would support a multilingual deliberation. And what was for me a powerful moment was to see how you framed the risk around how you said the risks associated with framing these processes as neutral or facilitation as a neutral practice, which led me to stop using this term, because a lot of people at the time, 6 or 7 years ago, were using neutrality as the framing and moving more towards other concepts and approaches. So I'm really interested in how the book, I know it's a bit old now, but I think it's still relevant because it's raising questions, I think, for us as practitioners, particularly on how we can support social movements actually do deliberative democracy, and whether there's any is there any things that we need to reflect upon in terms of neutrality and integrity and other concepts like this. What have you learned from the last few years that will help, us as practitioners?
Thank you so much, Claire. So I've become old and very critical. So when I was working on the book, I was really angry at how unequal movements are and how decision-making was always biased towards the people who had the power in the room, not just in the movement, but the movements were the best case. And so in the meanwhile, I became, I'm that's terrible. No, so basically, I think still that it's not possible to do something neutral, but what's really, really important is to have rotation. And so with the Global Assembly, it's so easy. I mean, in theory, you have this diversity of cultures. You can bring in another country, another organizing group. Oh, you don't want because you want to, or so it's always this, it's the most important thing for organizers is, I think, how much do you let go? So these Latinx and BIPOC activists in the United States who basically practiced political translation that I found was the most advanced that I have seen. they said, oh, we are the Washington, D.C. organizers, but we also constantly travel around the country. We speak to the local communities, the excluded, the working class, the poor. So we are bridging, but we actually have the knowledge on how to put them all together and have them have great decisions. But we let some of that power go, and we make we basically allow 2/3 of our national organizing team to come from the local level, from those whom we want to empower. And they said this means, but they are not always right. They don't have our knowledge. So that was a powerful attempt of letting go, and it has risks. It may mean that your whole process bursts up. They were lucky. They had huge participation, and they used a lot of tools to tackle the isms, so that people who would never talk with each other would actually sit at the table. So when you bring foes and enemies together to listen to each other and to cooperate in a respectful atmosphere, you can actually change the world. But that is so hard to do. So we will often invite people who are okay with each other. So I think it's a never-ending process. Yeah. Maybe neutrality is not so bad. No, I don't know. But yeah, it's a political translation. That would be my answer. Thank you. Thank you. I have no other questions to give other people the voice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.